Hi there, let's take a look at another potential source of finance for a business. This one is grants. To get a grant, you need to fill in an application. And what do you get? Well, a grant usually results, if successful in the application, with a one-off payment to the business from the organisation administering or giving out the grant. Sometimes it's government, sometimes it's other organisations, such as local development organisations or councils. The process, though, does involve an application. So with a grant, there's no guarantee in most cases that you will either get the grant at all or the amount that you are applying for. And the grants are there to try to encourage a business to take desired actions. For example, investing in innovation, or perhaps a grant to encourage a business to set up a production or business activity in a specific location. Grants can also be there to help businesses gain advice and support, for example, through coaching and mentoring, and therefore grants are often associated with supporting startup or smaller businesses. And we've also seen during the pandemic and during lockdown an increased use of government and other grants, particularly from local authorities, to help support businesses. So, for example, grants towards rates costs and that kind of stuff. Well, grants, if you can get them, are quite an advantageous source of finance for a business. The main reason being that normally you don't have to repay them. It's a payment into the business that doesn't need paying back. The only situation where the grant is repayable by the business is, for example, if the business fails to meet the requirements of the application process. For example, perhaps doesn't take on sufficient numbers of employees or doesn't meet the obligations that it agrees to when it applies for the grant. Now, grants themselves can be either small, and typically a lot of small businesses might get small grants for business support, but they can also be very substantial, particularly where it involves incentives for businesses to locate in particular places or to invest in R&D and new technology in specific industries. Another advantage of a grant is that as a cash payment, it should have no impact on the share capital and therefore the business ownership. And of course, if the grant is there to support the business taking risks, perhaps by making investments, in theory, the grant reduces the risk. It reduces the financial risk, doesn't it? Because it provides a contribution towards the cost of the investment or the risk that the business is taking. It all sounds great. So what are the downsides? Well, one of the problems with grants is that actually they're not that widely available, certainly not for well-established large businesses. There are grants in many sectors and in some locations, but by and large, businesses don't tend to rely on grants as a source of finance. Another downside is that they can take a lot of time to apply for, depending on the process that the grant provider is requiring businesses to fulfill. And of course, there's also no guarantee that having invested all that time and sometimes money in applying for your grant, that you'll be successful. So there is a risk that you spend money and cost and time, but don't actually get any financing at all. And I suppose the last downside is that grants by their nature tend to be one-offs. Though of course that doesn't mean that business can't apply for further grants, perhaps from different organisations. There we go. That's just a quick overview of one of the potential sources of business finance, which is grants.